Today we have Vic Bolton, Joanne Conway, and joining us shortly, Matt Foster. Vic is Head of Talent and Culture at Vida Connect Specialists. Joanne is Head of DEI at EY UK, and Matt is Director of DEI at Ogilvy UK. We'll jump straight into questions. So, Vic, I'm going to direct the first one at you. From your perspective, what are the main things you've come up against when trying to build a business case for ED&I, and how have you overcome those barriers?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. So I think in my experience, I've worked for global corporates as well as startups. A lot of the time, it's a lack of understanding and awareness. That barrier is prevalent in all of those businesses that I've worked at, actually. And it's about key decision makers and influencing them, educating them on the benefits of it. So higher employee engagement, better decision making. A lot of it is resistance to change as well. Often individuals or teams might just not want to disrupt the status quo. And again, it's having those difficult conversations. A lot of the time it's fear too. No one wants to say something they're not supposed to say, or put their foot in it, or say something that's disrespectful just through a lack of education. So a lot of the time those uncomfortable conversations need to happen. So I think showing the benefits that has as well on the organisation to remain competitive and really relevant in an ever-changing market as well. And employee engagement can sometimes be really, really hard, especially in a smaller business where there's not necessarily a team of ED&I specialists. So creating a culture where people can speak up about how they feel. One of the things that we do at the moment is lunch and learns, where I encourage different people, not just my voice, to speak up about matters that are important to them, that they're passionate about. And it's a slow and steady thing. Don't expect change overnight. These things take a lot of time. My advice would always be to, keep educating time and time again. I mean, for example, I've set up a Slack channel where we am at the moment, and I put the information in there regularly for people to either engage with in the moment or in their own time. There's loads of resources that you can share as well. One of the ones I But yeah, ultimately it's just keep going with the information, the resources, the case studies, the examples of how it really works, and don't expect overnight change. That would be my key advice.
Yeah, that's great, Vic. I really sort of hone in on the what you were talking about with the lunch and learn. Here at Culture Shift, we have something that we call our Shifter Spotlight, which is an opportunity once a month for someone to stand up and, to be honest, talk about something that they're passionate about. That can be professional, but it can be personal as well. And it's a really great experience. It provides all sorts of opportunities for people, like practicing presenting and things like that. But ultimately, the thing that I get the most out of is just learning about the people that you're working with and getting a better understanding of what makes people tick. Giving people the opportunity to really stand up and go, this is me, this is who I am, this is what I care about. And that's such a wonderful way to provide that sort of inclusive experience that allows people to really showcase what they're about.
Yeah, no, exactly. I find that helps people to feel empowered as well. But it also, I've seen a greater respect for each other as well, once you understand that everybody has their own opinions and feelings and passions as well, and really understanding. But yeah, I think it's little things consistently, but for stakeholders, key decision makers that don't necessarily understand it, go to them with data, go to them with proof that, look, this works. We're not doing it for no reason. And there's so much information out there to be able to prove that this is something that we all need to get on board with. And I guess don't don't shy away from those difficult conversations, because I always find that putting yourself in an uncomfortable position is where growth comes, whether that's in personal endeavors or business endeavors. So have those difficult conversations in the right way, obviously, but put yourself in those uncomfortable positions where you might have to have a challenging conversation with somebody that's not personal, but it's business related, and keep relating it back to the facts. But yeah, small wins, I think, incrementally over time create big change.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Thanks for that, Vic. Matt, thanks for joining us. Apologies for the technical difficulties that meant that you came in a little bit late. The conversation at the moment is around sort of the main things you've come up against when trying to build a business case for ED&I and how you've overcome those barriers. Wondered if you had any thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, can you hear me okay, everyone?
Yeah, absolutely fine.
I mean, there's so many things that can get in the way of people understanding that ED&I is good for business. But I think the one I really want to focus on is this kind of idea of siloed thinking, or this idea that you can just hire someone to do DEI on behalf of the organization. And at the root of it, it's really about people not understanding what good ED&I is. And essentially, you know, when you have that as your kind of baseline, it is a very tough barrier to kind of get over. You know, I sometimes advise colleagues or friends of mine within the ED&I community who are looking for new posts to always kind of understand the situation and see, you know, what the employer thinks about in terms of, you know, what good ED&I looks like. But, you know, there is a role that we also can play in terms of being able to show people that true integrated ED&I is good for business. That it isn't something that is a function that would just be siloed in HR. That, at least for me, you know, from an Ogilvy perspective, we are a creative agency. We create advertising and public relations and marketing and social campaigns for some of the world's biggest brands. And for us, we have a completely integrated approach to ED&I. It is, yes, policies for our people, infrastructure that we need to put in place that ensures that equitable practices mean that we can even out the uneven playing field that the world kind of imposes on us. But it's also the work that we do, the makeup of our account teams, the diverse suppliers that we work with, how we cast for our campaigns, and then further on, the great impact we can have on the world, because brands can play an amazing part in shaping culture. And, you know, I think in November last year, we launched the Consumer Equality Equation, which has, I think, some of the richest cuts of data that show the power of being able to communicate to minority ethnic communities and the brands and the role that brands can play. So when you think of it so holistically and you think the full extent of what good ED&I looks like, I mean, it's really tremendous. And sort of siloing it kind of really kind of scuppers it. I'd say I'm fortunate because I work in an organization that really gets that. They totally get integrated. And I remember being interviewed for my role about a year ago. And, you know, it was all I could talk about, and clearly it aligned with what their view was and their vision was for the business as well. So, yeah, I mean, there are many things, but for me, you know, that kind of focus on siloed thinking is, you know, you're not even out the gate posts then, and you've really got to think beyond that, and you've got to think beyond just people. You've got to think about beyond just HR. You've got to think about beyond just policies. It's operational, it's behavioral, it's the connective tissues, and it's throughout the business.
Yeah, absolutely. That point of it being so, you know, ingrained in a business is like so important to get like the right results. Like our research says that 46% of employees think that their workplace could do more when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and 42% say that the workplace only really makes like surface level token gestures. It's not good enough for diversity and inclusion to simply be a tick box, and we've done this, right? Moving on, it's got to be so ingrained in your culture and the way you work and everything that you do for it to have that impact that it really needs to have.
Yeah, I say absolutely, and it's not that I have sympathy for organizations. It's just an interesting word that do performative or tokenistic DEI, but I do understand that some folks think that that's ED&I, that they don't actually know any better. I mean, those that do know better, shame on them, but most organizations don't understand that. And I think hopefully we might have a conversation here, for instance, about, you know, cultural moments and events and what role do they play? Because I think, again, there's an interesting conversation to be had around what is performative and what's really substantive, and what are the intentions behind these kinds of initiatives. And I think really that sparks that whole conversation about whether or not you're doing something effective and good for the business, because tokenistic stuff which just ticks a box actually doesn't move the needle. So there's a bit of an inherent contradiction there. You're ticking a box because you think you have to for the business, but you're not actually achieving the great business outcomes that good ED&I can achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. I always like to describe it as that diversity inclusion, it isn't a new requirement, but it is a conversation that is really starting to gather steam now. And so it's not expected that everybody knows exactly how to achieve it. But if you go into it with your best intentions and you learn from the best, you know, that's when you can get the results, because we're all learning together, we're all trying to achieve together. And ultimately we all just want to provide that culture and that safe workplace that everyone requires. Joanne, did you have any comments on this topic?
Thanks, Ash. I think just to add to it briefly, because I think Vic and Matt have covered it really well. I think on following on from, I guess one of the points Vic made is around also connecting it with the business priorities. So understanding that DE&I is a strategic priority, but actually understanding what are the business priorities, what is it that they're trying to achieve, what are their gaps, what are their challenges, what problems are they having, and how can you align the efforts and work that we're doing from an ED&I perspective to that, so that it accelerates the change. It's not an add-on. Actually, this is going to be a massive competitive advantage for your business, but also from a people perspective. And of course, that links into retention and all of those great things that come from that. And then to Matt's point around branding, I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough in this space is, yes, it is a value add, and there are so many things that come from having DE&I as an absolute thread throughout everything that you do. But there's also a massive risk if you don't, you know, if we don't do that. And I think that's one of the things when you're building out a business case, certainly when you talk about these are all the benefits that can come for it. But actually, when organizations are already really profitable, they're already doing great, sometimes it's a bit like, yeah, but it's really hard work. And actually, is it worth it? And that can be a harder, and everybody wants different things. So being able to talk to people in different ways and be able to articulate that these are all of the benefits, these are all the reasons why we need to do it. But also, there is a huge risk to businesses being left behind in the market, not being able to attract the right talent, and definitely loss in terms of reputation and branding, which we've seen play out in the media, that, you know, can really damage organizations from a reputation perspective. So that's the only things I would add to those.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all too easy, you know, as a man working in finance, it's all too easy to look at the financial implications of things, but there's a real people element, and that has knock-on effect. You know, the reputation, the financial risk later down the line absolutely add up. So you need to have the foresight to be able to recognize when these things that are in place are so important for the people element, but actually from the business element as well, it's actually equally important. And there's a big education there in making sure that sort of senior leaders really get that. I guess that segues quite nicely onto my next question, which is about having senior leaders that get it can make like a massive difference, but some aren't as lucky as others as to have someone in their corner advocating for this level of change. Joanne, we'll start with you. What would your advice be for them?
The biggest thing that I've learned in this, and I've been in professional services for nearly 20 years now, and working in the ED&I space for nearly 10 years. So I think the biggest thing is we need to meet people where they are. I think sometimes too often there's a rush for, particularly when you're working with senior leaders that perhaps are nervous around this topic, that they're not necessarily sure what to do. They're experts in their space. They really can be nervous about getting it wrong. They've got really good intentions, and I think for that, it is actually, I think, Vic, you said that really well around incremental changes. Sometimes, particularly when you work in this space, patience is one of the key skills that you need to have, and actually empathy and understanding that, and getting to know individual leaders. What are the blockers, and not just going with an ask or demand that this is what you have to do, but actually getting to know them. What's getting in the way? How can I get to know you as an individual? How can I support you? What do you need? And sometimes that's practical things, so like building out simple things. We often assume that it's easy, and for some of us that know what to do, we may think, oh well, like it's just easy, I'll just tell you what to do. But actually, some of the leaders really need that, tell me what to do, but also like show me how to do it. And that might be some practical toolkits, and then they will use their power and their influence and actually learn and be able to go on to be advocates in this space. So I think that's part of it. Not everybody's going to get it, and you're never going to get everybody on the bus. That's just life. That's the reality of it. So you have to be, I would choose where to put your energy, and as long as you're getting the majority of people along, that's the main thing. But certainly meeting people where they are, understanding, and as long as people are on the journey, it doesn't matter what stage of that continuum they are on, as long as they've made that commitment to move forward on it. So that would be my biggest piece of advice around that, I think.
Yeah, that's super useful. I mean, I know that before I joined Culture Shift, this was something that wasn't really on my radar, like admittedly. And having spent 3 years here now, I'm seeing the importance of it. I am now an advocate, but I myself have been on that journey, and I think we all have been on that journey. And it's really important to understand where people are and where they might need guidance or coaching or advice on that journey to help them get to that level that ultimately we want everyone to be at. Matt, did you want to comment on the
Yeah,
scenes?
I sort of like to continue the spirit with which Joanne gave her comments, because I do think we can be very hard on our leaders, and I know I have to fight that urge to express that, oh, you should know this, etc. But actually, it is a journey for them, and leaning into the empathy that we're asking them to employ is really important, and the patience. And I also think that with leadership, we are here to support them. That's our role. I see it as sort of one of my primary roles when it comes to discharging my function. And I also know that lots of people have had aha moments, sort of Damsian conversions, and some of the most inclusive leaders I know have told me about those aha moments, and it's different for everyone, but often it's some moments in time where something has resonated very personally with them, and they've thought, oh, well, goodness me, if that had happened to me or to my children or to my wife. And I think, some people can say it's a real privilege, to use that sort of empathy route to understand how, let's say, marginalized or minoritized groups experience trauma. I think empathy is a good thing. I think love is a good thing. I think these are the things that make us really lean into and understand what experiences are like for people who have not had the same privileges as many of us have had. I think of what we're doing at Ogilvy at the moment, and we're slap bang in the middle of a 6-month inclusive leadership program, which was one of my priorities when I joined just under a year ago. And it in our program is not, and there's nothing wrong with unconscious bias, don't get me wrong, but we're the building blocks to inclusive leadership for us are things like vulnerability, empathy, continued cultural intelligence. These are the sort of fundamental principles behind which inclusive leadership can really flourish. And halfway in, I've seen quite a few aha moments among our 36 strong board. And yes, people are on a journey, but I've seen people asking more questions. I've seen people getting me involved in more conversations. I've seen people really trying to lean in, and I can see them struggling too. And as Vic sort of said, that kind of struggle, those crunchy moments, that's when the growth happens. So to anyone who doesn't have to, back to your question, enough people on their side who get it, so to speak, I'd say think about ways that you can support your leadership to get there. Think about ways that you can help them have their aha moments. think about supporting them with becoming more inclusive leaders.
Thanks, Matt. I feel like we could talk about this subject all day, but I'm gonna move the conversation on because there's quite a few questions coming in from the audience that I want to make sure we have time to cover. For Vic, your experience in talent development and recruitment spans across huge multinational organizations, from charities and startups. What do you think each of these organizations can learn from each other when it comes to getting senior buy-in to the ED&I business case?
Yeah, so yeah, I've been lucky enough to work with some huge organizations, and then contrastly, startups and SMEs, and it's been great. And I think, when you look at global multi-corporations, they have huge budgets, they've got allocated resource, and by the nature of the size of their business, they're usually far more diverse workforces anyway globally. So they typically have those really extensive resources. They're able to do a lot with big budgets, and they're able to make that part of kind of every function across the business, across these matrix organizations. But on the back of that, there's also a lack of pay. So you go to a startup, and what they have on their side is the way they think really innovatively, and they've got so much pace. They're a lot less risk averse, and fair enough, they might not have the budgets in place, or even a team that's dedicated to ED&I. But as Joanne and Matt have both said, these things have to be a part of the business as a whole. And what I've seen in my experience of startups is that it's part of their strategy from the ground up. They started off with this, this business idea, and part of that already was ED&I as part of that. So it's really exciting to be able to be part of that, and see that evolve and grow. And in my experience of working with startups as well, this is something that's already, that's something that's not needed to be implemented. It starts straight away. So you have these, monthly stand-ups, you learn about each other. Typically the startup I was in was also very creative. So, you've learned about different creative passions and things like that as well. So they are at the forefront of their mind, able to work with agility and innovation. And I think that they can learn a lot from the bigger multinational corporates, in that they're proof that, investment financially into these programs brings the results, and creates the noise where it needs to be made. But I think the bigger corporations can learn a lot from the smaller startups, in that, it feels a bit more authentic because they're able to move at pace in the moment. When something really matters to them, they can go on about it without that red tape, and be able to create really impactful messages both internally and externally. And I've always said, certainly in my role at the moment, I'd rather us be making noise internally and doing nothing externally, because we don't have a budget right now for it. For example, we're a small business. So I'm at the moment, it's early days, but I'm more about, let's make the noise internally and learn before we go out with anything, targeted. Or I feel that it can sometimes lose its authenticity in that case. So it works really well in both of those instances, and I think that those are the key things that they can learn from each other, I guess. But yeah, startups, it's inclusivity from the start. But with the multinationals, they've got the big budgets, they've got the departments that can work across those multinational matrix environments. So yeah, there's definitely a lot to learn from each other.
Amazing, thanks. Definitely interesting, different challenges depending on the size and scale of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Joanne, building a business case is one thing, but then there comes proving the business case. Have you got any guidance on sort of measuring and setting key KPIs to ensure that that business case is being proven?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the things that we really need to think about from a really looking at moving from the outputs to outcomes. So actually, when we're doing, sometimes you can do lots of great things, but actually, are they outputs. So you're doing things and there is an output to that, but actually what are the outcomes, and how are those outcomes being measured? So as in, when you do something, how is that actually going to meaningfully benefit your people, your organization, your community, the wider society? And that can be more difficult to do, particularly in the ED&I space. I think sometimes that can come back to the challenge with the business case. How do you measure that? But there are definitely things that can be measured, and I would say that having targets can be helpful from that perspective. And I think one thing that can get conflated sometimes is this mix between quotas and targets. So at EY, we have a number of targets. We also have KPIs in place. And so, for example, from a partner perspective, so within our organization, it's partnerships. So partners are the most senior leadership, for those of you not familiar with that hierarchy. And we set back in 2019 a target to double the representation from a gender and ethnicity perspective. So moving from 10% to 20% ethnic minority, of which 15% will be Black, recognizing that within the ethnic minority population in particular, we were underrepresented from a Black perspective. So that is something that we wanted to make sure that we had a real focus on. And then from a women perspective, going from 20% to 40%. And we have made more progress in the last 3 to 4 years than we have in 10 years in terms of that targets and having that measurement and keeping it on the agenda. However, what I would say is really important is that it isn't just about the target. You have to really understand, how are you changing the playing field? So actually, what are you doing in terms of understanding the processes, the ways of working, the systemic changes that need to happen? It's never about fixing our people. It's always about the right people for the right role. So when we set those targets, we really did a lot around behavioral change, organizational change, and reviewing everything that we do in terms of how are our systems set up, and do they advantage some groups over others, and if they do, what can we do to break that? So there's the kind of systemic perspective, but then also the behavioral perspective as well. So as Matt mentioned around that inclusive leadership piece, but really bringing all of our employees, including leadership, on that journey. So measuring the impact, having those examples that I've given where you can really see the difference, but also listening to your people, getting the feedback, looking at your data from a holistic perspective. So you might do a really great job in terms of hiring, but actually, are you promoting people in a fair and equitable way? Are you retaining people? Because actually you could be, having an increase in your female hires, but actually you're also have got an increase in your female leavers. So what's the net in terms of that effort? And in my experience, building out that fuller picture and being able to articulate that in the business is really helpful in terms of measuring the impact of things. And also things like, if you've got podcast, what's your reach, who's listening? If you're running events, who joins? Have you got clients that are joining? So there are ways that you can really think about it. I think the main thing is it has to be strategic. It has to be thoughtful. You have to think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're going to measure it. And most importantly, is this going to matter to our people? And Vic, what you said really resonated around, personally, I'm not in this business to win lots of awards and do lots of showy things. If this is not going to make a difference to our people, then I don't want to invest our time. I know there is a business, reason you have to obviously have a brand, and when you're doing great things, we should talk about it. But when you're not, then I think that there's a lot of that going on, which I don't really agree with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a fairly common pitfall of businesses feeling like they recruit diversely and so they're doing a great job. But if they don't provide that inclusive culture, those diverse hires are going to leave and you're going to be left in a similar situation than you were previously. So that next step is equally as important, right? Matt, when people think about building a business case for ED&I, the mind often switches to money, but I think that paints a pretty one-dimensional picture of what's needed in order for ED&I to succeed within businesses. What asks needs to form the basis of an ED&I case?
it's a very good question. I mean, I've worked for organizations where there was no money, and now now I have what I consider to be a decent budget that has to be spent very, very wisely and strategically. I think there are so many ingredients that go into what an sort of effective ED&I can look like, and as part of building the case, i.e., what do you have to invest in order to get the outcome? If I try and sort of categorize them broadly, I can think of sort of two areas. It's the operational asks, and those things include things such as budget, infrastructure, where people like me sit in terms of reporting lines, for instance. Am I empowered to make decisions? What channels of communication do I have and do I own? Those sorts of pieces, and they include things like policies and some of the structural things that need to be changed from an equity perspective. And then I'd say the second category, broadly speaking, is behavioral. And what are the behavioral things that need to happen in order for good ED&I to take place? What are the things that impact behavior? Joanne talked about behavioral change and business transformation. Those things are really, really key, but also kind of quite intangible too, in terms of how do you create that culture of belonging? How do you, I talked about connective tissue earlier on, it is that kind of slightly kind of interstitial, slightly abstract, how do we change the environment around us? But there are things that you can do and put in place. We talked a bit about metrics here, for instance, and you can put KPIs, for instance, on leadership and people managers in terms of how they behave, and the expectations that we have of them. So, and to Vic's point, you might be in an organization where you just don't have the budget, and you have to make do because you might be a small startup or a much smaller company, and you have to think very laterally and creatively about that, and very much focus on the essential things that are going to make the most change for people. But yes, I mean, beyond budget, it is things such as empowerment. I mean, I've just launched a initiative called the Community Empowerment Initiative, and it's how we work with our networks, for instance. I don't call them ERGs because they're not resource groups for us to plunder. They are communities within their own right. And for us, good ED&I has evolved in the sense that we don't ask them to lead on our cultural moments. It's not their job to educate the rest of the organization. If they want to, that's up to them. They're empowered to. If they wish to, it's up to them. It's their discretion. It's not about benevolent marginalization. It's about putting self-determination into their hands, and actually a lot of stuff being led from the center, from me, from the business, whether that's, so for instance, a solid example, Black History Month, there is an initiative that we're doing from the center that the business is leading on, which is a partnership with the charity. And then our cross-cultural community network is focusing its entire month on activities for themselves, everything from cookery courses to calligraphy to celebrating their own cultures for them, and it's not about external stuff and saying, hey, we're doing performative ED&I here. It's giving our communities a budget for them to celebrate themselves, and at arm's length, kind of having that autonomy. And that's a progression, right? That's a progression from what you've seen in the past in terms of kind of free labor, which I really object to, and asking people who, like I mentioned before, might have had very traumatizing experiences to suddenly lay themselves bare to educate other people. That's just like one example of like, what does good ED&I look like? Well, it also looks like, an evolved way of working with communities and networks. It also is holding our leadership and people managers accountable for how they behave. It's ensuring that the company is open to forward-looking policies that actually enable good ED&I to take place, whether that's for the menopause, whether that's for shared family leave, whether that's recognizing, whether it's recognizing same-sex couples, and all along the spectrum of gender expression, and expressions of faith and what that might mean on people's personal time. I mean, it's kind of that openness to that I think level of progressive thinking that will ensure that ED&I is hopefully successful.
Great, thanks, Matt. Conscious of time, we've had quite a few good questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to jump to a couple of those. If we don't manage to cover all of them, well, we won't. We'll try and follow up with some answers after the event. Please feel free to jump in if anyone has good answers to these. One question's come in that says, how worried should ED&I leaders be about growing opposition to our industry? As an example, from the more right-wing media and politicians. How do we know how many of our colleagues share those views, and what should we do about that? Anyone like to jump in on that one?
I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, I've just spoken, but I can jump in. I'm personally speaking, I'm not worried about it. And I think was it you, Ash, who said something along the lines of, you know, this is not new. None of this is new. None of these concepts are new. Social injustice is not new. An uneven, you know, inequitable playing field in the world is not new. And perhaps as a business function, it might seem like a new part of business, but actually, a solid example again, when I think of inclusive leadership, I just think it's good leadership, right? And the inclusivity bit is just integrated into that. But now that it's expected, as it should be, you know, standards have evolved in many areas when it comes to business practice. Employers, for instance, are much more involved in the well-being of their people. That these things happen over time. You know, I come from an industry where my agency used to be one of the original Madison Avenue Mad Men agencies, where men were smoking cigars and women were secretaries, right? Abysmal. We have moved on, and we are continuing to progress. And, you know, the kind of resistance against that comes from maybe slightly more right-wing media, I mean, I don't think that's new either. And whether or not we have colleagues who espouse those feelings, they have every right to. This is, you know, we live in a world where, you know, other people will have other views. That is the point of diversity and inclusion. They might rub up against my own personal views, but I have to be tolerant of what I consider to be intolerant views, up into a point, obviously, because there's a line that can be crossed where one's right to free speech actually becomes hate speech, as an example, and that's something else. That's something else to deal with in a different, you know, kind of scenario. That is a sort of a behavioral issue that, you know, we would have to look at in a business context if someone was sort of pushing that agenda. That's my personal perspective.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. Like, hate is going to hate, right? But normally that just means that we're all doing something right. That it's people are sitting up and taking notice, and you know, that education piece is so important. Let me jump on to one more before we go to wrap up. Sometimes told and understand that training isn't always effective. What have you seen or done that works in terms of driving inclusive leadership practices in people managers?
Happy to give an example of that. So one of the things I've done is working with leaders, similar to what I've said around meeting them where they are, but also building practical toolkits, but having intact leadership teams. So what I mean is working with the leadership team. So for a particular department, that whole leadership team, in my case, there may be 10, 12, 15 senior leaders of the business, but really having that contract with them around, these are some of the things that we can work on together. This is what we will support you on, but this is absolutely what we will need from you. And if they don't agree to that, then we move on. You know, we move on to someone else, because you have got to, if we're going to invest that time with them, then we need to make sure that this is something that is, they're going to be committed to, that is sustainable. And that becomes a journey that you go along with them on. So it's bringing the senior leader, so the most senior leader of that team, having a one-to-one, understanding with them, what is it that's going on for them? What are some of the dynamics that I need to understand about their team? Because there will be, what's visible, what's not visible, what are some of the gaps that they may see? How can I support and our team support on that? And then working with that leadership team and really working with them to understand what is it that they want to achieve, what is going to be, what is going to move them along on that journey, wherever they are. So they may be at stage 1 in the continuum, they may be at stage 3, but making sure that it is bespoke to what it is that they need to do, and then going with them on that journey. So setting them up, almost putting the stabilizers on, staying with them for a while as they move through that journey, which is a 6-month, year-long plus beyond journey. It never ends. and then you step back and you encourage them to do more on their own as they continue to do that. So I think that is what I've seen. I think having people in a workshop and they walk away, while there's good intentions, they kind of go, well, that's great, I believe all of that, I want to do something, but I have no idea how that applies to my day job. So my experience is it takes more effort, it takes more investment. I know not everybody has that, but that's where I've seen real sustainable change.
And
absolutely,
really quickly on the back of that, in a smaller organisation, I work in a business where typically leadership roles, management roles come from the more that you bill, essentially. There's a slight change there in that it's now part of the leadership development program is that you have to be invested in the behavioural side of things as well. ED&I is part of your job. You can bill as much as you want, but if essentially your values aren't aligned to that of the business, which we've collaboratively, collectively done together, then you won't make management, you won't make leadership, because it's about more than money. And in a business where billing is what we do, we have that motto of it's always people over profit, always, and getting the leadership team on board with that, so that it streams down to those that are aspiring to be leaders. They have to get on board with that.
Amazing. We are sadly running short on time. I feel like I could have sat here and talked you through for hours about this, and maybe we will at some point. But thank you again to all three of you for sharing your experiences and advice. And I hope everyone found them insightful and helpful for helping to build and take your cases to senior leaders and succeed in showing them the necessity of what you do and why they should care. If you're interested, our next webinar, How Employee Activism Can Influence Your People Strategy, takes place on the 10th of October, just in time to celebrate Black History Month, so you can make awareness dates like this and others matter to your people. Also, we have recently launched our new podcast, The Culture Shift, hosted by our Head of Culture Transformation, Vicky Bars, where they sit down with an array of incredible guests to explore a wide range of topics across ED&I, HR, workplace culture, and well-being. And talking about incredible guests, the next episode features yours truly, and we dive into the cost of bullying and staff turnover, prioritising ED&I and investing in culture. That's out tomorrow, so please do watch or listen to that. Our team is putting the link for the podcast in the chat box now, so please remember to listen and subscribe. We'd also love to know what you'd like Vicky to talk about on future podcasts. And with that, thank you everyone for joining, and we do hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vic, Matt, Joanne. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.